Dad, wedding stopped by. Son, reveals bride's staggering betrayal. Dad calls police straight away. 0130 hook. Imagine standing in a church, surrounded by flowers and candlelight, watching your father about to marry the love of his life. The organ swells, the guests rise, the bride glides down the aisle in white, her smile perfect, her veil catching the afternoon sun streaming through stained glass. Your father's eyes are wet with tears of joy. He hasn't been this happy since your mother died 3 years ago. And then you realize something that makes your blood run cold. The woman he's about to marry isn't who she says she is. In fact, she's wanted in 2 states. And if you don't stop this wedding in the next 60 seconds, your father will lose everything he has left. So you run. You sprint down that aisle holding a folder of documents that will turn this ceremony into a crime scene. And as every head turns toward you, as your father's face shifts from joy to confusion to horror, you know that what you're about to reveal won't just stop a wedding, it will shatter the man you've been trying so desperately to protect. This is the story of Thomas Brennan, a 58-year-old widower from Columbus, Ohio, who thought he'd found love again. And this is the story of how his son Daniel uncovered a betrayal so calculated, so meticulously planned, that it would take months to untangle the full truth. Because what happened at Brennan Chapel wasn't just a canceled wedding. It was the culmination of a sophisticated con that had been running for nearly 3 years. And it almost worked. 133 setup. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how this happened, you need to know 3 people. Thomas Brennan, the father, a retired firefighter who spent 28 years running into burning buildings to save strangers. A man who neighbors described as solid, dependable, the kind of guy who'd shovel your driveway without being asked. But after his wife Rebecca died from ovarian cancer in the spring of 2019, Thomas became someone else, quieter, withdrawn. The house felt too big, the silence too heavy. His friends tried to help, but grief has a way of isolating you, even when you're surrounded by people who care. Then there's Daniel, his son. 28 years old, worked in IT security, analytical by nature, protective of his father to a fault. Daniel watched his dad fade after his mom's death, and it killed him slowly, watching someone so strong become so small. And then there's Elena Ruiz. At least, that's the name she used. Dark hair, elegant features, warm brown eyes that seemed to understand pain in a way that felt almost intimate. She spoke softly, laughed easily, and had a gift for making you feel like you were the only person in the room. But there was something else, something Daniel couldn't name at first, a performance quality to her warmth, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. 3:10. The relationship begins. Thomas met Elena in October 2019, 6 months after Rebecca's funeral, through an online grief support forum called Together Through Loss. It was a private group for widows and widowers, moderated carefully, designed to be a safe space for people navigating the hardest chapter of their lives. Elena reached out to Thomas first, a private message, after he'd posted something raw about missing his wife's laugh. She said she understood, that she'd lost her husband Michael 2 years earlier in a car accident, that some days the grief still ambushed her in grocery store aisles or when a certain song played on the radio. Thomas wrote back, then again. The messages became daily, then twice daily. Within weeks, they were talking on the phone, long conversations that stretched past midnight. Elena had this way of listening that made Thomas feel heard in a way he hadn't since Rebecca got sick. She asked about his work, his childhood, his dreams. She shared stories about Michael, about their life together, about the small coastal town in Oregon where she grew up. Everything felt natural, easy, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Daniel noticed the change in his father almost immediately. Thomas was smiling again, humming while making coffee, planning things beyond the next day. It should have been a relief, and for a while, it was. But something nagged at Daniel. Small things, inconsistencies, Like when Elena mentioned growing up near the ocean but couldn't name a single beach. Or when she talked about Michael's accident but the details shifted slightly each time. The kind of shifts you'd miss unless you were really paying attention. Daniel was paying attention. In January 2020, Elena flew to Columbus to meet Thomas in person. Daniel drove to the airport with his father and watched Thomas pace the arrivals area like a nervous teenager. When Elena emerged from the gate, she looked exactly like her photos. Warm smile, confident walk. She hugged Thomas like they'd known each other for years. And Daniel saw his father's shoulders relax in a way they hadn't since his mother died. Over dinner that night at a steakhouse downtown, Elena charmed everyone. She asked Daniel about his work, laughed at his stories, complimented the photos of Rebecca that still hung throughout Thomas's house. She didn't try to replace his mother. She honored her memory. It should have put Daniel at ease. But that night, after Elena had gone to her hotel, Daniel lay awake replaying the evening. Something about the way she'd answered questions. Too smooth, too rehearsed. Like she'd anticipated every topic and prepared responses. He told himself he was being paranoid, that grief made people careful with their words, that he was looking for problems because he didn't want anyone taking his mother's place. But 2 weeks later, something happened that Daniel couldn't ignore. He stopped by his father's house unannounced and heard Elena on the phone in the guest room. Her voice was different, sharper, colder. She was speaking low, but Daniel caught fragments through the door. Something about timelines, about moving faster, about Thomas being more trusting than the last one. The last one. Daniel stood in the hallway, heart pounding, trying to convince himself he'd misheard. When Elena emerged 5 minutes later, she was all warmth again. Said she'd been talking to her sister about a family issue, but her eyes were different, flatter, and for just a moment, Daniel saw something that made his stomach drop. Calculation. Cold, precise calculation. He didn't say anything to his father that day. He had no proof, just a feeling. But that feeling wouldn't go away. 10:20. The manipulation escalates. Over the next year, Elena integrated into Thomas's life with alarming speed. By March 2020, she'd moved to Columbus permanently, claiming she needed a fresh start after losing her job in Oregon due to pandemic layoffs. Thomas offered to let her stay in his guest room temporarily. Temporarily became permanent by June. She was good at being needed without seeming needy. She cooked Thomas's favorite meals, organized his medications, drove him to doctor's appointments. She made herself indispensable. And Thomas, who'd been drowning in loneliness, clung to her like a life raft. In August 2020, Elena started talking about money. Casual mentions at first, about her savings running low, about medical bills from a procedure she'd had before moving. Thomas offered to help immediately. Elena protested, said she couldn't accept, but eventually relented when Thomas insisted. $5,000, then another $3,000 2 months later, then $8,000 in January 2021. By March 2021, Elena suggested combining finances, said it would be easier for budgeting, for planning their future together. Thomas had already begun talking about marriage. Elena played it perfectly, acting hesitant, saying she didn't want to rush, that she needed to be sure. The hesitation made Thomas want it more. Daniel watched all of this with growing alarm. He tried talking to his father in April 2021, bringing up the money, the speed of things, the fact that Thomas barely knew this woman. Thomas shut him down hard. Accused Daniel of being unable to let go of his mother. Said Elena made him happy, and that should be enough. They didn't speak for 2 weeks after that fight. It was the longest they'd gone without talking since Daniel was a teenager. When they finally reconciled, Daniel tried a different approach. He asked careful questions about Elena's past, about Michael, about her family, about her work history. Every answer felt plausible on the surface but impossible to verify. Elena had explanations for everything. Why she wasn't on social media, why she didn't have photos from her wedding to Michael, why her family was estranged and she didn't like talking about them. Trauma, she said. The accident had broken more than just her heart. In July 2021, something happened that should have been a massive red flag. Elena disappeared for 2 days. No call, no text. Thomas was frantic. He filed a missing persons report, called hospitals, drove around Columbus looking for her car. Daniel helped search, his suspicion temporarily overridden by genuine concern. When Elena finally came home on the third day, she was shaking, crying. She told Thomas she'd been grabbed outside a grocery store by a man she thought was Michael's brother, that he'd forced her into a car, that he'd held her in a motel room demanding money she supposedly owed the family, that she'd escaped when he passed out drunk. Thomas wanted to call the police immediately. Elena begged him not to, said she was terrified, that Michael's family was dangerous, that getting authorities involved would make things worse. Thomas, protective and terrified of losing her, agreed to keep it quiet. Daniel didn't believe a word of it. No marks on her, no fear in her eyes, just performance. He pushed his father to report it anyway. Thomas refused. That's when Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in background checks and fraud cases. He paid her $3,000 of his own money and gave her everything he knew about Elena Ruiz. Sarah called him back 6 days later. What she'd found was incomplete but deeply troubling. Elena Ruiz existed, but barely. No employment history before 2018. No social media footprint. No property records. No marriage license to anyone named Michael. And the name itself appeared to be relatively new, possibly changed within the last 5 years. Sarah needed more time and more money to dig deeper. Daniel gave her both. But before Sarah could finish her investigation, Thomas did something that made Daniel's blood run cold. He proposed, and Elena said yes. 2035-0, the wedding planning. The engagement happened in November 2021 at a restaurant overlooking the Scioto River. Thomas had planned it for weeks, enlisted Daniel's help picking out the ring despite their tension. Daniel went along with it, hoping the investigation would turn up something concrete before things went too far. It didn't, at least not fast enough. Elena played the excited bride perfectly. She talked about wanting something small and intimate, just close family and friends. She suggested they marry at Brennan Chapel, a small historic church on the outskirts of Columbus, where Thomas's parents had been married 40 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on Thomas. It felt like a blessing, like Rebecca herself would have approved. The wedding was set for March 2022, 4 months away. During those 4 months, Elena made another suggestion. She and Thomas should open a joint account for wedding expenses and future plans. Thomas agreed without hesitation. He transferred $80,000 into that account. His life savings, money from Rebecca's life insurance, money he'd planned to leave to Daniel. Daniel found out by accident when he saw a bank statement on his father's kitchen counter. He confronted Thomas immediately. Another fight, worse than the last one. Thomas accused Daniel of jealousy, of trying to sabotage his happiness, of disrespecting Elena. Daniel accused his father of being blind, of being manipulated, of throwing away his future for a woman he barely knew. Thomas told Daniel that if he couldn't support the wedding, he shouldn't come. Daniel left his father's house that night, not knowing if he'd ever be welcome again. But he didn't stop digging. Sarah Chen, the investigator, finally got a break in January 2022. She found a name connected to Elena's digital footprint. Not Elena Ruiz, Elena Vasquez. And before that, Elena Morrison. And before that, Laura Keene. 4 names, 4 identities, 4 different lives. Sarah traced Laura Keene back to 2014. She'd been married to a man named Gerald Keene, a 62-year-old widower in Arizona. Gerald had filed charges against Laura in 2016 for financial exploitation. She drained his accounts, sold property without his knowledge, and disappeared before police could arrest her. The charges were eventually dropped when Gerald died of a heart attack in 2017. Elena Morrison appeared in Nevada in 2018, engaged to a retired teacher named Philip Morrison. That engagement ended abruptly when Philip's daughter discovered inconsistencies in Elena's background and threatened to go to the police. Elena disappeared before that could happen. Elena Vasquez surfaced in Portland in 2019, briefly involved with an older man whose family intervened before any financial damage was done. And now she was Elena Ruiz, engaged to Thomas Brennan. Sarah's report included criminal complaints, financial records, and witness statements from 3 separate families who'd been targeted by this woman. It was 53 pages long, and it arrived in Daniel's inbox on the 10th of March, 2022, 8 days before the wedding. Daniel read every page twice. Then he called his father. Thomas didn't answer. Daniel drove to the house. Elena answered the door. She smiled at him, calm and pleasant, and said Thomas didn't want to see him. That maybe after the wedding they could all sit down and talk. Daniel asked to speak to his father anyway. Elena said no, very politely, and closed the door. Daniel stood on that porch, holding a folder full of evidence, knowing his father was inside, knowing Elena had successfully isolated him, and he realized he had one chance left, one moment where his father couldn't ignore him: the wedding itself. 35-0, 45-0 the wedding day. The 18th of March 2022. Saturday. Unseasonably warm for Ohio in March, 68 degrees and sunny. Brennan Chapel looked beautiful. White flowers everywhere. Pews filled with Thomas's friends, his old firefighter crew, neighbors, people who'd known him for decades. Daniel wasn't invited, but he came anyway. He wore a suit, he carried a folder, and he waited in the parking lot until the ceremony started. Inside, Thomas stood at the altar in his best suit, hands trembling slightly, eyes scanning the crowd. He looked happy, nervous, hopeful. The organ began playing. The doors at the back of the church opened. Elena appeared in a white dress, simple and elegant, holding a bouquet of white roses. She walked down the aisle alone, her face serene, her smile soft. She looked like every bride in every wedding photo you've ever seen. Except Daniel knew what she really was. He waited until she was halfway down the aisle, until every eye in the church was on her, until the moment felt perfect and inevitable. And then he walked in through a side door. He didn't run at first. He walked quickly, purposefully, toward the altar. A few people noticed him and frowned. Thomas saw him, and his expression shifted from joy to confusion. Elena saw him, and something flickered in her eyes. Fear. Calculation. She kept walking. Daniel started running. He reached the altar just as Elena arrived. Thomas opened his mouth to say something. The officiant, an older man named Reverend Peters, who'd known the Brennan family for years, raised a hand as if to stop the interruption. Daniel didn't stop. He moved directly to his father, handed him the folder, and said loud enough for the front rows to hear, "Dad, you need to see this, right now, before you say anything else." Elena tried to take the folder from Thomas. She smiled at the guests, said something about Daniel being upset, about family drama, about how they'd work it out later. Thomas opened the folder. The first page was a photo. Elena, but younger, under the name Laura Keene, in a wedding photo with Gerald Keene. Thomas stared at it, confused. Daniel flipped to the next page. Criminal complaint, financial exploitation, theft. Thomas's hands started shaking. Elena reached for the folder again. Daniel pulled it away. The church was dead silent. 200 people watching. Elena's voice changed. She wasn't smiling anymore. She told Thomas that Daniel was lying, that he'd fabricated these documents, that he'd been trying to sabotage their relationship from the beginning. Thomas looked at his son, then at Elena, then at the folder, and Daniel saw the exact moment his father's world collapsed. The color drained from Thomas's face. His knees buckled slightly. Reverend Peters moved to steady him. Thomas looked at Elena and asked one question. "Is any of this true?" Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at the guests, at the doors, calculating her options. Then she did something no one expected. She ran, kicked off her heels, and sprinted for the side exit. Daniel moved to follow her, but Thomas grabbed his arm. "Let her go," his father said, his voice hollow. "Just let her go." But they didn't let her go, because Daniel had done one more thing before coming to the church. He'd called the police. 2 officers were waiting outside. They'd been briefed. They had the investigators' report. They had a warrant for questioning based on the Arizona charges that had been reactivated when Sarah Chen provided new information about Elena's whereabouts. When Elena burst through the side door of Brennan Chapel in her wedding dress, she ran directly into Officer Martinez and Officer Keller. They asked her to stop. She didn't. They asked again. She tried to push past them. They arrested her right there in the church parking lot, in front of 200 wedding guests who'd poured outside to see what was happening. Thomas watched from the chapel steps. Daniel stood beside him. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Brennan cried in front of his son. 45-0, 55-0. The truth unravels. The investigation that followed revealed something even Daniel hadn't anticipated. Elena wasn't working alone. The man she'd claimed was Michael. Her dead husband was very much alive. His real name was Marcus Webb, and he was Elena's actual husband. They'd been running this con together for 8 years. The scheme was sophisticated. Elena would target widowers, usually through online grief forums or church groups, places where vulnerable men gathered. Marcus would handle the background work, creating fake identities, establishing paper trails, monitoring finances remotely. Sometimes he played the threatening ex-boyfriend or the dangerous brother-in-law, creating external pressure that made the Mark more protective of Elena and less likely to question her. The kidnapping story Elena had told Thomas? Rehearsed. Marcus had been in Columbus that week, but not to threaten Elena, to scout the next target. They'd done this in 4 states: Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and now Ohio. They'd stolen a combined total of over $400,000. Some victims never reported it out of shame. Others, like Gerald Keene, had died before seeing justice. The joint account Thomas had opened with Elena, she'd planned to drain it the day after the wedding and disappear. The marriage itself was part of the con. It created legal complications that made prosecution harder and gave Elena access to assets she couldn't touch as a girlfriend. Thomas would have woken up on his honeymoon to find his account empty and his bride gone. By the time he realized what happened, Elena and Marcus would have been in another state with new names, targeting someone else. But Daniel had stopped it, barely. The trial began in August 2022. Elena pleaded not guilty, claimed she was a victim of Marcus, that he'd coerced her into the cons. Her lawyer painted her as an abused woman who'd had no choice. The prosecution brought in witnesses from Arizona and Nevada. They brought in financial experts who traced the money. They brought in Daniel, who testified about the inconsistencies, the investigation, the moment he'd stopped the wedding, and they brought in Thomas. Thomas sat on the witness stand for 4 hours. He described meeting Elena, falling in love with her, believing every word she'd said. He described the loneliness that had made him vulnerable, the desperation for connection that had blinded him to red flags his son had seen immediately. He described opening that folder at the altar and feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath him. The defense attorney asked him if he'd ever actually seen Elena commit a crime. Thomas said no. Asked if it was possible Daniel had misunderstood things, that Elena had genuinely cared about him. Thomas looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he said, "She knew exactly what she was doing. Every smile, every touch, every story about Michael. She knew, and I was too lonely to see it." Elena showed no emotion. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found her guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 2 counts of identity theft, and 1 count of elder exploitation. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Marcus Webb was never found. He disappeared the day Elena was arrested. There's a warrant out for him in 4 states, but as of now, he's a ghost. Probably already using a new name. Probably already targeting someone else. Thomas got most of his money back through asset forfeiture, but the $80,000 Elena had transferred was gone. Spent. Untraceable. The house felt emptier after the trial. Daniel visited more often. They didn't talk about Elena much. When they did, Thomas would go quiet, staring out the window, and Daniel knew his father was wondering how he'd missed it. How someone so smart, so careful, had been so thoroughly deceived. One evening in October 2022, 7 months after the wedding that never happened, Thomas asked Daniel something. "Do you think I'll ever trust anyone again?" Daniel didn't have an answer. Still doesn't. Thomas goes to therapy now, twice a week. He's started volunteering at the fire station again, mentoring younger firefighters. He sees friends more, but he doesn't date, doesn't talk about meeting anyone. The loneliness is still there. Daniel can see it, but now it's wrapped in caution. Maybe that's safer. Or maybe it's just a different kind of prison. 55-0, 60-0 closing. This case stayed with me long after I finished researching it because it asks questions I'm not sure I can answer. How do you protect people from someone who understands exactly what they need and weaponizes it? Elena didn't just steal Thomas's money. She studied his grief, mapped his vulnerabilities, and built a version of herself designed specifically to exploit them. She knew he wanted someone to fill the silence Rebecca left behind, so she became that. She knew he felt guilty for moving on, so she honored Rebecca's memory. She knew he was protective, so she became someone who needed protecting. Every move was calculated. Every word was scripted, and it almost worked. If Daniel had been less suspicious, less persistent, less willing to risk his relationship with his father to uncover the truth, Elena would have succeeded. Thomas would have married her. She would have drained his accounts. And he would have spent the rest of his life wondering what he'd done wrong. So I want to ask you something. Would you have noticed? If someone entered your life right when you needed them most, if they said all the right things and never made an obvious mistake, would you have seen through it? Or would you have been like Thomas, desperate enough for connection that you ignored the small inconsistencies, the tiny cracks in the performance? What about the people you love? Your parents, your grandparents, anyone in your life who's lonely, who's grieving, who might be vulnerable to someone like Elena? Would you notice if they were being targeted? And if you did notice, would you act, even if it meant risking your relationship with them? Even if they hated you for it? Daniel saved his father, but it cost him 2 years of tension, fights, and alienation. He did the right thing, but it wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. And even now, I don't think Thomas knows how to thank him. Because being saved from something like this doesn't feel like being saved. It feels like having your judgment, your perception, your entire sense of reality questioned. And that's a wound that doesn't heal quickly. This story isn't really about crime. It's about how grief makes us vulnerable, how loneliness blinds us, and how love, even when it's complicated and painful, can save us from things we didn't even know we needed saving from. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have trusted Elena? Do you think Thomas should forgive himself? And do you think 12 years is enough? I'll be reading every response. Thanks for watching. And remember, the people who love you enough to tell you hard truths, even when you don't want to hear them, those are the ones you keep close.